Hello and welcome to the third of the Missing in Action conversations. Today we are with Nicola Drew, who helped me through PTSD. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nikki and ask her to introduce herself and just tell us a bit about yourself.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me on. It's a brilliant project you and Dave are working on, so it's a pleasure to be able to help. I work as a psychotherapist, as a coach, and a 3 principles practitioner. A lot of focus of my work is as a trauma specialist, and in that I work with veterans and their families, emergency services personnel who've experienced trauma, and also the general public who've been through traumatic incidents. So yes, it's great to be able to share with you today with your project.
Thank you. So we're going to start with PTSD. What is it?
Okay, so post-traumatic stress disorder, as it's commonly known, it's actually a range of physical and emotional symptoms which occur post-trauma, a traumatic experience. Sometimes, not every traumatic experience will result in PTSD. There are a number of reasons why it would, to do with levels of stress, intensity of the trauma, and how many reoccurrences of trauma there have been in a person's life. So yes, the range of symptoms are all to do with either the inappropriate firing of the fight, flight, flee, freeze response, or the avoidance of that response. So people are either experiencing a real strong nervous system attack, you might call it, or the symptoms are to do with doing anything in their life to avoid that. And that shows up in numerous ways in people's lives, all very difficult, all very limiting to people's lives.
So I know this helped me. Could you explain what happened to the brain? What happens to the brain with PTSD?
Yeah, of course. So in very basic terms, you might want to split the brain into the lower part, which is all about survival. And there's two security guards in there called the amygdala that are constantly scanning the environment and our internal thought systems for any sign of danger. And that part of the brain is very primitive, very effective at keeping us alive. Okay. The other part of the brain, which you might call the boss, or the rational part of the brain, is the neocortex. So the newer part of the brain, which sits on top of the primitive part. And that's the bit that makes us human. It's our rational, logical thinking brain, clear, rational reasoning. Now, what happens in trauma is that the person experiences a huge stress response because of the situation they're facing. And often PTSD comes about when that stress response is so high that the survival part of the brain almost gets stuck in that response. Okay. So those security guards, as I said, they're always checking the environment. All of our sensors go through there. So, everything we see here. And they use a crude pattern match. So this reminds me of that. Okay. Now, the response when those security guards feel that you're in danger will either be fight, go towards anger, attack the danger, flight, run away, get away, anxiety, or freeze. If the person feels they aren't able to fight, flee, they might go into freeze. And the freeze response actually produces more PTSD than the other two, because there's an inactivity, a trappedness. Okay. So what happens is the security guards will do whatever they need to do to try and get you out of that danger. Now, this happens quite regularly for us as humans. And what happens is when the stress hormones reduce, the boss, the rational, logical part of the brain would then come along and put that situation into a context. So this happened, you know, at this sort of time and this sort of day because of this sort of circumstance. So the memory is processed, the amygdala calmed down, and the memory is placed in a different part of the brain on a chronological timeline. Now, what happens with PTSD is the amygdala are in such a state of shock that the system doesn't calm down enough to give it perspective. So the pattern match becomes a perpetual trigger. So for example, if an incident involves, say, a red car, as the person went through the incident and then the person then calmed down and got their rational, logical brain online and were able to process it, they would understand, oh, this happened on a Tuesday in the high street in a rainy condition with this specific driver and this car, and it happened last week, right? With PTSD, that calming down effect doesn't happen, and the amygdala just grabs onto red car, rainy day. And then every time the person either remembers or sees a red car or it rains, the amygdala is saying, you're in life and death danger, right? And so the person is haunted by this pattern match about actually the safety part of the brain, which is innocently trying to keep us safe, is inappropriately firing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. It really does and resonates. So what would be common symptoms, or what do you see as common symptoms?
Yeah, there's a whole range. So flashbacks, very common. Nightmares, hypervigilance. You know, for someone without PTSD, the ability just to walk in a cafe and sit down without really thinking. With a client with PTSD, they report, I have to check out before I go in, and then my back has to be against a wall so I've got clear view of everything. You know, so that type of hypervigilance, sleep problems, relationship problems, anger responses, anxiety, fear, panic attacks, conflicts in relationships, disassociation, not feeling like you're really there or unsure if you know the event actually really happened, these types of things, psychotic breaks, faulty coping mechanisms, which are a whole other batch of, you know, can create problems in a person's life. So alcohol, drugs, overeating, overexercise, not having the motivation to really look after themselves physically, food, nutrition, exercise, you know, conflicts at work. I'm sure I've missed many out, but you know, there's a whole raft of both physical and the emotional side. And as I said at the beginning, all of those are related to the fight, flight, freeze response firing inappropriately, or the person not willing, understandably, to put themselves in situations where that might get triggered and they have the big response.
Yeah. So with relation to veterans, emergency service personnel, and in your experience, what are the really common traits or feelings that they tend to express when they come to see you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it takes a lot for these people to come to a therapist, because they're in a field, whether they're veterans or emergency services, where they're, helping others, or they've been trained in a certain way to cope, just get on with it. And they're having these experiences which to them feel wrong or weak, or actually some of the experiences can make it feel like you're losing grasp with reality. So even to turn up in a therapist's room, I really take my hat off to them, and there's a common theme that they will think that it's something personal about them. What's wrong with me that this is happening? And part of my job is assuring them that you've got a survival part of your brain, and you've got a nervous system, and this happens to brains and nervous systems regardless of who you are, actually. Yeah. The other thing is the pervasiveness of how it's impacting their life, not just their work, but their home life, hobbies, relationships, their sleep. It goes through all of life, and it begins to make it hard for them to continue doing things where they would get some respite, where they would get some meaning and purpose. When you're stuck in that stress response, it makes no sense for the nervous system to allow you to relax. It thinks you're in immediate danger. Why would it want you to relax and just be able to watch TV or be with your loved one? Why would the nervous system want you to have a peaceful sleep if it thinks there's danger there? It wants you to be alert. It wants you to be on guard, right? So that's another thing. And the other aspect is, and actually it's the most dangerous aspect, is it feels permanent. People have a sense that something has happened so profound to them that it's never going to change. And that's dangerous because it takes away the possibility and hope of a peaceful life. Yeah. And part of my job is creating an environment, a space where even the possibility of even a small change becomes, evident, and then growing that with small steps sometimes, but sometimes more immediate. It's different for everyone. But yes, it's that, those three things are really debilitating and actually are part of the lie of PTSD, part of the lie of low mood, because actually one of the symptoms I didn't mention is depression and low mood. And in that state, it sort of sucks the joy and hope out of life. But with the clients, all very different circumstances, as you see the nervous system calm down and they zoom out a little bit, they get a little bit of perspective, they start to see, the hope for the future, which is wonderful to witness, actually, as a therapist.
Can we talk about suicide and suicidal thoughts?
Yes, again, I didn't include that, but very, very common. Obviously, if the mind is telling you, and the mind is doing its thing, you can't choose what the mind is doing, okay? And if part of your symptoms, and actually for the general population as well, is suicidal ideation, are those thoughts of just wanting peace, that the mind on one hand is telling you there's something wrong with you, possibly it's telling you you're broken and you shouldn't be feeling this way, you're a burden to your family, it's always going to be this way, and actually I've got an idea that might help. Right. Now, I would call that faulty thinking. not it's wrong to have that thinking, but actually the mind is telling you that peace isn't available in life. And that's not the case from what I've seen in the work that I do. There is always potential for peace in life. And so it's understanding that when the suicidal thoughts come in, that they are a function of a stressed system, and it's the mind trying to give you a way out, but not to believe them, and certainly we don't need to act on them. And actually, as people start to see this and start to calm down, the thoughts can still come, but they don't necessarily frighten them in the way that they're used to, and eventually the thoughts possibly will stop. But what I would say to anybody, if they are having suicidal thoughts, is you know, to reach out and talk, whether that's with friends, loved ones, a therapist. Samaritans, 24 hours a day in the UK, 116 123. Also, you'll find on the internet, and I know the Samaritans have one on their website, which is a suicide safety plan, which I would recommend anyone who's having suicidal thoughts, and certainly anyone who has had plans of suicide, to go on and download that safety plan. And it asks some questions about reasons why in a calm state is possible, and possibly with a trusted person or with a charity to fill this in. You know, why you don't want to follow through, you know, so there. What helps? So numbers that you might ring, you know, things that you might do if thoughts come along. And what helps you? What do you enjoy? So for some people, so what you're looking for is a 5-minute gap, you know, something that might get you out of the trance, because suicidal ideation puts us in a trance state. We're hypnotized by the thought, and so we're looking for something, even 5 minutes, to help us zoom out a little bit. And so that might be, for some people, it might be putting music on. For some people, it might be, you know, being with a dog for 5 minutes. It can be anything, ringing a friend. It's for that person to start to think about what might give them those few minutes, enough time so that they can then hopefully contact somebody, borrow that person's calm brain until they get themselves on steadier ground. And if you're dealing with a loved one, you know, who's having suicidal ideation, I would say, you know, keep that communication open. It can be quite frightening to even talk about it as if it's going to make it happen, but actually, no, asking, you know, people if there's anything they can do to helping them fill in the suicide safety plan, helping them get appropriate help through services. Yeah.
So, understanding that everyone is different, how have you helped clients achieve that peace of mind, that break, that fire break, the aha moment? Can you?
Yeah. Well, everyone obviously is different, like you said, but there are some common themes with PTSD. Obviously, it is a huge stress response. So the first thing with anybody is attempting to help them reduce stress. And for people that will be different for everybody, but helping them find healthy coping mechanisms to reduce the stress response in the system. There's a common breathing technique that we use in the type of therapy I do called 7-11, which you can look on YouTube. It works by increasing the relaxation response in the body. So tricking the nervous system out of the stress response and into the relaxation response. And I'm sometimes embarrassed, you know, when veterans or people come and you know, begin and talk, and I start talking about relaxing, but actually it's what's needed to help break that state. And also, you know, as a therapist, I sometimes use the metaphor of, you know, a hurricane, the storm, and there's in the eye of the storm. So when a client comes, and they might never have told their story before, and actually I don't need them to tell a story. It's not about reliving anything, but sometimes people do find it helpful to talk things through with someone who's not invested in the story, who can keep a safe space for them, you know, to talk. But going back to the hurricane metaphor, you know, all of the symptoms whirling around, and it's sometimes whirling around so fast that it's overwhelming. So the suicidal thoughts, the depression, the flashbacks, you know, all whirling around. And it's really easy to, you know, the person is consumed by this, understandably, because it's so vivid. You know, the internal system that it's using, the memory, the imagination, it's like an internal reality generator. So they're thinking this stuff, they're feeling it, they've got sensorial feedback. But as a therapist, obviously I acknowledge this that's going on, but I also know at the heart of that, in the eye of the storm, there is a space, right? And whatever anybody, and I mean anything that a human has been through, that space remains. They might not be able to feel that. They might not even know that it's there because they're so consumed with the storm, which is understandable. But as a therapist, that is what I'm talking to, because I know that is the potential for transformation, right? And so as I continue to look and talk to that place, usually what happens is this starts to slow down a little bit, and the person begins to sense, feel that themselves, occasionally, sometimes, right? And in that space, in that place, it's where insight comes from. It's where creativity comes from. You know, if you've really wrestled with something you don't know how to solve, and you're gripped, and you, I don't know, you give up, you go in the shower, you take the dog out or something, and oh, there's the answer, right? The answer doesn't come from all of this noise of the mind, from the storm. It comes from dropping into that place. It's not really a place, but it's a metaphor. Dropping into that space, that space that cannot be broken by life, right? And it's why I love what I do, because to wake someone up to that space, even for a moment. So I'm always interested when I speak to people who are experiencing trauma. I'm trying to, you know, I talk to them about interests and hobbies, and, you know, a lot of those things have stopped. But sometimes, because I'm looking for, do they ever get a taste of peace, even if it's a second? And so I'm pointing them and I'm asking, and they'll say, actually, you know, I went fishing a few weeks ago for the first time in ages, and for about 5 minutes, there was peace. And I'm thinking, that's it, right? That's it, that's a doorway in. And so we're always looking for the well-being. I'm always looking for the potential for transformation. I'm always trying to point the person back to this refuge, this place inside that isn't caught in the storm, which for people with trauma is often very difficult to feel, but it's there. I've not met a human yet who, you know, hasn't been able to find that even briefly.
So what would be your recommendation to anyone who's suffering from trauma, what to do?
Okay, well, firstly, understand you're not alone. You know, there are many people who've experienced trauma and have come through trauma. So holding even lightly the possibility of change, the possibility of finding peace is really important. Even if the mind is saying, no, I mean, this is different, there's no way, just even slightly holding the possibility that this can change, I would say is important. The other thing is, if you feel at any risk to yourself, obviously reach out, get support. We've lost far too many people through trauma. Like I said, the Samaritans, trusted people, therapists. In terms of what people can immediately start doing for themselves, is anything at all that can help calm their nervous system down. And that will mean different things to different people. Even a 1% reduction in stress will begin to start having cumulative effects, because it will open out more ways of relaxing. So it might be, one thing you could start to do is choose 3 safe things that you commit to doing every day. And they need to be small. We're not wanting to overwhelm the nervous system, and pick realistic ones. It could be as simple as getting dressed, walking the dog every day, having 1 healthy meal a day, 1 hot meal a day, listening to 10 minutes of music, or just small things that you start to make a commitment to each day, to start to help you calm the nervous system and get a sense of some control. That's why we want to make them small, because the mind will say no. But if you make them small, you might trick the mind and just do them anyway, right? And each time you do them, you're creating a new neural pathway towards recovery, calming the nervous system down. I mentioned 7-11 breathing. There's lots of techniques. If you look at calming the nervous system down on the internet, there's loads of different various techniques that people can use, grounding techniques, breathing techniques, guided meditations, white sound, waves, bird song, all of these different things. And again, it'll be really different for everybody. So start to know what works for you. Try things. Not going to lose anything by trying things. The other thing I would say is, often with trauma and PTSD, people feel hijacked because the reactions are there. The anger's there before they know what's happening. But just start to zoom out a little bit and start to know your physiology a little bit more. For me, I tense my jaw when stress is going up in my system. For other people, it will be other things. But just starting to know the early warning signs, and psychologically, what are the early warning signs? When we start to really zoom in and black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, catastrophic thinking, all signs that we're in a stress response. And also knowing the difference. So how does it feel if you do have a refuge of a little bit more clarity and peace of mind? How does that feel? What are the characteristics of that? So that you know where you are in terms of your nervous system. You're starting to get to know yourself, and you start to get to know what it feels like to be in the eye of the storm rather than when you're in the storm. And also I would say, go easy on yourself, because that emotional hijack that we do get from the security guards, when we're in that state, we say and do things that later, if we do calm down a little bit, we judge ourselves, make no sense, right? But in that state, we're using a very primitive part of the brain, and we're doing the best we can during that time. So what I would say is anything you can do to be calm in the system before, during, and a big emotional hijack, you're just going to be doing whatever you can. But then afterwards, sort of drawing a line and calming the nervous system again and starting afresh. So, just easing off and not really judging yourself too harshly. And also, there's some really useful techniques for trauma. One of the ones I use is called the rewind technique. You can look that up. There's EMDR, which is the rapid eye movement. There's a tapping technique, emotional freedom technique, which calms the nervous system down just by tapping acupuncture points. I know we're really interested in 3 principles. That's a really useful understanding for people to start to see how the mind works, how thought works. And I think Dr. Bill Pettit has a video on YouTube about PTSD. You might be able to put the link for that under. Yeah. And I know the work that you've done with the missing link and things like that might be useful for people just to start exploring. So it's getting curious, really. Starting to get curious about the possibility of change. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that's been really, really useful, hopefully to anyone that's suffering trauma or knows someone that is, to understand that those symptoms, the feelings are universal, they're not individual. I think that's a really big help. So when I spoke to Dave, it was the last conversation I had with Dave Hill, and I said, I had this idea of a book. Actually, I was completely blowing my own trumpet far too much. And actually the idea did not come from me. It was reading your book from the heart. And can you just briefly tell us the premise of the book? And how you set out the book, because we're following the same template.
That same premise, yeah. Well, when I was talking about the eye of the storm, yeah, and where creativity and inspiration come from, I almost don't feel I can take credit for the book either, because it arrived, the idea just arrived to me. Okay, so I've written it for charity. When my son, who's now 18, was born, he had an undiagnosed heart condition and required heart surgeries, when he was very, very young. And so as he was turning 18, I thought, what a nice way to mark his 18th, something that we didn't even know if he would achieve, at some points in his life, with a book to help other people. And the proceeds go to HeartLink charity, which supported, me and us. So the premise of my book, the first part, I tell a little bit about my journey, from where I was, in going through that difficult event, and my sort of search to understand life, really. What's it all about, and then what I did was I reached out to people who I knew had transformations or insights that had one day their world looked one way, and then either in a short period of time or incrementally over time, they had an insight or a shift, and suddenly life looked different. They had a different experience of sometimes the very same life, and so I reached out to those people and asked them just a couple of questions about unconditional love and true nature, and what that meant to them, and how that had changed their lives. And it was wonderful. I did videos with some people, so interviewed them and then transcribed it. Some people wrote their own, but there was such a diverse population that responded, and so they're so beautiful. And so it's a privilege, really, to be able to put that in the book, and for all of us to consider like who we really are, not what our symptoms are, not what our behaviours are, not what the content of our mind is, not what really we're led to believe, but underneath the noise, like who we really are. And so that was it's one of my favourite explorations. So it was really good. And I'm really pleased that, you know, because I had loads of insecurity, like I'd never written a book before, and who's going to listen to me, and who am I to write? You know, my mind chatter was all the imposter syndrome going on, and I haven't got time for this, and I don't, you know, all of that stuff. But actually the book happened and it's out in the world, and I'm really grateful. And also when you said, you know, you messaged me, didn't you, and said, oh, I had this idea, it, you know, just that warm feeling that, oh, from something that I nearly didn't show up to, but in the end I did, and it happened, for that to ripple out, you know, into the veterans and to emergency services, wherever it goes, just to touch a life that might touch another life, right? Because again, something, you know, I love as a therapist is as their nervous systems calm down and the focus goes on that, oh God, this feeling inside is so awful, what inevitably happens is it flips out, and it's like, how can I serve? It's happening with you, isn't it? You know, how can I help? How can I show up? And it might not look like writing a book. It might be like leading a football team, or starting a litter picking group. It could look like anything, but inevitably people go from this internal sort of stressful, torturous place to how can I serve? How can I be a better dad? How can I show up in life? And what that does is it builds meaning and purpose into their life, which is what we need as humans, right? Mm. And then to see that ripple effect going out is just a delight, really. So, yeah, really pleased it's happening for you.
Well, the book's called From the Heart, and thank you to Nicola for joining us today, for going through all of that. I know that's going to be an enormous help for everyone.
You're very welcome. And thank you for inviting me along, and good luck with the book. Can't wait to read it.
Great, thank you. Neither can I. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.